let's go to our message tonight. We're in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. We're up to verse 29. So we saw last week that they said, oh, Daniel, that guy can interpret dreams. And he said, let's bring him in. So we're going to start off in Daniel 2, 29 through 45. It says, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. What should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets, make it known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have, more than any living, but for the sake that thou shalt make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold, broken to pieces together, and become like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. So, remember, the king had a dream, he forgot what it was, but it really troubled him. So he said, if you can tell me what the dream is, I will kill you. And Daniel said, yeah, I can do that. What's that?
You didn't tell him anything from that, but...
Well, you could have, but it had to have something to do with the dream. I'm sure he, as he was telling me, he probably remembered parts of it. He would have said, that's not the dream I had, off with his head. So, Daniel made sure that he said, listen, the dream that you had was not so it was for my benefit, but it was that God wanted to show you some things that would come to pass. And so he says, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And whosoever the children of men dwell, wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art his head of gold. And after thee shall rise another kingdom, inferior to thee, another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forsomuch as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of the iron, forsomuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with the miry clay, and as the... Yeah, hold on, my thing popped up and I lost my place. So the parties drawing is, and as the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the day these kings shall be the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to the people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For so much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass thereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. So, what does the interpretation mean? Well, the first 4 parts of this, we believe, have already transpired, so therefore we can tell you what we think they meant with pretty much certainty. And that's not going to work. So the head of gold, they talk about the four kingdoms. The first one was the Babylonian kingdom. That was the head of gold. The next one was the Medo-Persian kingdom. The next one is the Greek and Romans. But they also, all of these things fit into the history of the world. Now, there's a couple of other things that are interesting about it. It's confirmed by the correct use of metal described by those empires. So, Babylonian splendor was gold. Remember, what did Babylon do when they captured the Jews and took them into captivity? They stripped all the gold from the temple, all of it. So they had all the gold. Remember, he likes all the gold wins. So Babylon's splendor was gold. Now, why the head was made out of gold? So it fits perfectly in with that. But we also know that Babylon was the head of gold because Daniel told him. He said, the head of gold, that was you. But then after your kingdom, there's another one that's going to come in. And who were they? They were the Persians. And it was the Medes and the Persians. They came in, one came in first, and the other one took over, and then they kind of grouped themselves together. And we know that that's what happened because in history that's what happened. And they were economically inferior. They were also inferior in might and strength and everything else. And their claim to fame is silver. Just like it said in the statue that it was silver. But then they were going to be taken over, and they were going to be taken over by the Greeks. And the Greeks were known for their bronze armaments, okay? Their chariots were bronze. A lot of their instruments of warfare were bronze. Had a lot of bronze. Now, bronze is pretty strong. And so that's where the next kingdom came from. Then the other one, which we're pretty sure, and by the way, I read a bunch of commentaries, and almost every single commentary agreed. There were some fringes out there that had some other things to say, but for the most part, they all agreed. And then the last one was the Roman Empire. The Roman mastered the use of iron, right? Everything in the Roman Empire was iron, which they used to stomp all over the Mediterranean. So those parts are sure, but then we get into the 10 feet and the toes of clay and iron, and that's highly disputed amongst a lot of biblical scholars that we don't know for sure what that is. Now, I have some thoughts on it which make a little bit of sense, but we're only going to talk about what we know. So what do we know? We know for sure is that after the fall of the Roman Empire, there were no more one-world kingdoms after that. Okay? So after the Roman Empire fell around 60 AD, that was it. Then nations sprang up all over the place. And nations, yes, some nations conquered other nations, but nobody went in after that point in time and subdued the whole world. So at the end of that, when you take a look at the feet that were mixed of clay and iron, clay and iron don't mix, by the way, no matter how much you melt the iron and how much you mix it with the clay, they will never stick together. So if you drop it, the clay will fall off the iron, and clay is not very strong, okay? So, also, every kingdom that came out after that were never as large. There were nations, you're getting almost into the modern era at this point. You're up to like 100 AD, 200, 300, then you get into the Dark Ages. Now, I didn't go any further along than that. I stopped there. I have a book by Dr. David Cloud that's called The History of the World, and there's part 1 and part 2. And part 1 was way early ancient history, and part 2 covers this time frame. And unfortunately, it's buried in my office, but when I get into my office, to my bookcase, I'm going to dig it out, and I'm going to start looking up the rest of this. So we're going to leave some of these things in the air. But a lot of that is speculation. And by the way, that was something I thought of first. And then I started reading, and there's a lot of different things that people say. But I will say, unequivocally, there were no world empires after the Roman Empire. That was the end of it. Now, what else did we see that was different? And let's skip the commentary part here. One of the things that happened also at the turn of BC to AD was that God, even 400 years earlier, stopped dealing with nations and God started dealing with the individual. At the same time, the Roman Empire fell. The church was established, right? Once the church was established, God dealt with individuals. It no longer mattered that, I was Jewish and that only the scriptures can come to me being a Jew, or that I'm the only one able to carry the oracles of God to the unsaved world. God said, now I'm going to deal with individuals by putting the Spirit of God in man's heart. So there were things that changed that made that part of Daniel's prophecy very different than the other part. The head, the chest, the thighs, the legs, and when you get down to the feet and the toes that are a mix, there's just a lot of things that could be different. Now, I read a commentary which is very interesting because he had a lot to say about it. And what he believes, and this makes, and like I said, a lot of these things make a little bit of sense. Who would they actually be if not a one world empire? How about a mixed race empire? Well, here's what this guy said. I wish I could remember where I got it so I could give him the credit, but normally I'll put the footnote down where I got it from. So I only have from a commentary. They all agree it's a little bit more mysterious and we don't know. But he says, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that clay mixed with iron refers to the Arab Islamic empire that began after the birth of Islam and Muhammad. Admittedly, I'm not absolutely certain about this interpretation, but I'm quite certain about the interpretation of the kingdom of Babylon, Mede, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And everybody is pretty much set on that. We know the order of the world, powers that dominated the whole world. And we saw in the reading in Daniel, where he said everywhere a man's foot stepped, you were a Babylonian. That's all there was to it. And they conquered everything. They conquered the entire known world. So that's not even in dispute. So then he talks about looking in Daniel 2:41 and 2:43, you'll find the word mixed in English. If you look at the actual Aramaic word, it's derived from the verb ARAV, which is in Hebrew. And it's based on the root word it gives that. It's going to mean, well, his bottom line is that it means Arab. And so he goes out on a limb and says that he believes that part of this is the Arabs. So now he's actually looking at it from more of a religious perspective as opposed to a world government perspective. Because once we got out of the Dark Ages, a lot of countries weren't really ruled religiously, they were ruled governmentally. And even though all governments of the world had a religious aspect to them, okay? So it was in England, back in the day, right, pre-United States of America, what was everybody so worried about? They were worried that the priest would go up to the king and say, King, I want you to write a law that says this. And the king goes, I'm not writing that law, are you crazy? And the priest goes, then I'm not going to absolve you from your sin, you're going to go to hell. And he's like, wait a minute, well, I'll just get somebody else. Nah, dude, I'm a higher guy. You're not going to go past me. You write that law, you're not getting absolved. And what did we get in our Constitution? In the First Amendment, we got a provision in there that our government will not respect the establishment of any religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. Where did that come from? That came right from the religious aspects of the English government being ruled by a religious leader. Now, it was covert, it was under the table, right? But that's where the religious and the government tied together. So when the United States of America was born, we said, we're not going to have that nonsense here. You're not going to be able to grant absolution to someone who's going to represent the people. And you keep that stuff to yourself. And we're not going to have it in our government. So He's looking at it from a religious perspective, that it was the Arab nations, and you look at all those nations of the world, all of the Arab nations that are there in the Middle East, which is really where they all started from. And it would make a little bit of sense that there's some mixed clay and iron together. So what else does he say? He thinks that the Arabs would mix with the iron, which is the Romans, but they would not cleave to one another. And as you know, both Roman Empire and the Arab Empire still exist today, although not in their original form. So he's trying to say that there is some remnants of that. And by the way, every culture pretty much in the world has remnants of the Roman government and the Roman culture that was around back in the day. So he is very careful to state, again, it's a theory, not something I'm absolutely certain of. The prophecy is notoriously difficult to understand. One thing I'm certain on is the identity of the first part. The clay is the unknown. So I thought that was pretty good. So what was the bottom line to this? So the bottom line we find in Daniel 2, 46 through 49. It says, "Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is God of gods, and Lord of kings, and revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king." So, right back to the top, once again, because God gave him the wisdom to be able to interpret this dream. Now, the only thing I didn't get into was the rock that came down and crushed the whole statue, and I'm still working on that one. So that might be, we're up to, I have this one labeled Second Story Part 2. We'll probably do Second Story Part B.
Joe, where's the revival of the Roman Empire here?
No real revival, just remnants of it.
I thought we were told that there was going to be a revival of,
No, the revival, the only revival that I'm aware of is when Judaism comes back into full swing, and they start doing sacrifices again, and whatever. And it might be a little bit tainted, because they're so far out from, 2,400 years from the last time they did sacrifices, so they may not know how to do it right. But that was the only thing. So, not a revival of the empire itself. And we don't know what the government's going to look like. One of the things that I did do is I just started on my Revelation study by just putting down my introduction. And this way, when I'm reading, if I find things that overlap between what went on in the book of Daniel and what goes on in the book of Revelation, because when we get into chapter 7, things get really crazy. And I just finished chapter 6, actually. So 7 through 12 are very different. And whereas we know a lot of what happens in the first 6 chapters are fairly easy to understand, with the exception of this rock and things like that. So, one of the things about the rock that came down and crushed them, it says that it scattered them like the dust. And when you start thinking about how Christianity spread throughout the whole world, right? Shortly after Jesus was crucified, and then he ascended back up into heaven, and the apostles came down, and the churches were started. It spread pretty quick throughout the world. Now, it only spread in one real direction, and that was actually, it spread northward. It didn't spread southward, which would have been toward Egypt. Okay? They already had their own religion down there, and I don't think they were interested in changing. They were still protecting the Jews from their chariots being crossing of the Red Sea. And it didn't spread east either, which is over to the Asian nations. It went north. And it went north into the areas today that we would know as Italy and Greece, England, France, Russia, all the Baltic states, all of that stuff. And then by default, it went westward over to the United States once the United States was founded. And that's where your big heavy influence is in the world. But that doesn't mean that in the modern world, and by modern world I say we even go back to the 1800s, the church has been sending out missionaries to the Arab world as long as they can get in that country. And that's where national missionaries work well. And they've been sending missionaries to the Asian nations as well, as long as they can get in there. And again, national missionaries work fantastic in that situation, because where the door is closed to a world mission organization, it's not closed to national missions. You know, someone who's a citizen of like Burma, Myanmar, they can go in there and they can start their own church and do whatever they want, you know, and so it does spread to these other nations, and that has kind of the, when you think about the knocking down of the world's rulers, right, of Babylon and the Medes and the Persians, and then scattering like the dust of the earth. Even from a governmental perspective, the governments that were in there, and we'll see this in Daniel chapter 6, that Daniel was appointed a president. Where did we get that word from? Well, used in the Old Testament, that Daniel was a president. And so a lot of our government structure that we have in the modern world has its roots in the structure that was there back in the Babylonian time, back in the Medes and the Persians, and back in from the Roman Empire. I'd say the biggest one is the Roman Empire, because it's the last and the most modern out of all four that were in that statute. It's very easy to see that there were things that we could pick out from that we could use in other governments that actually worked well. Now, there was another interesting thing, and I didn't write this one down here, and that was the Romans, because the Romans conquered a lot of the world which had a lot of slavery in it. The Roman culture was inundated with within its population a lot of slaves. And because they were not necessarily citizens, but they were slaves, someone postulated that the mixture of the clay and the iron was what was left of the Roman Empire, mixing citizens with slaves, because what were they doing? They were having children. Now, if you're a citizen of Rome and you marry a slave and you have children, what is your child? Now, I can look into that any further to see what it meant, but that's an interesting thought, that one of the reasons, and then, by the way, they believe that was one of the downfalls of the Roman Empire, is because they didn't have such a tight citizen base that almost half the population of Rome was slaves. And, you know, when you don't have a country that's made up of citizens, you can get yourself into trouble. Gee, where have we heard that before? You know, and unfortunately, when you start looking at things, you know, Solomon said it, he goes, nothing's changed under the sun. Everything is exactly the same. Back in those days, today, I even have one of my podcasts I'm going to be doing about how things haven't changed under the sun. I was reading something where I believe it was in Psalms, where the nations were going out and they said, we're going to take, and we're not going to stop until we've eradicated every Jew or every Hebrew, whatever they call them back in Psalms, off the face of the earth. And where do we hear that today? The same nonsense that we're hearing as the Arab cause spreads over to the United States and fools our young skulls full of mush, as Rush Limbaugh used to call them. And these people get up there and they start saying some of the most ridiculous things that you could ever hear from somebody out of their mouth. So it's the same thing going on back in the time of Psalms, where they wanted to eradicate the Jews. By the way, they didn't do it back then either. Then we had Hitler come in and he tried to eradicate the Jews, and he wasn't successful either. And now today we have the Islamic world who is pushing hard to eradicate the Jews as well. So a lot of things stay the same. By the way, I think it was Carissa asked me the other day, why do we have to learn history? It's because history has a way of repeating itself. And if you know history, you'll know the pitfalls. It's just like good business practice. Well, if I do this in business, what's going to happen? You're going to fail miserably. If I do this in business, then you might have a really good chance of being successful. It's all the same. That's why we learn. And that's why we learn history, because those people who made those stupid mistakes, I always told my kids, you watch the mistakes that your siblings that are older than you made, and then you learn not to make them. And the one who got that down the most was Tom. Tom, my second oldest son, goes, yeah, I just watched Joey, saw what he did, so I'm not doing any of that. And this way he didn't get into the same kind of trouble that Joey ever got into. So, it was a really good chapter 2 through the book of Daniel, and it had a great outcome, because as you can see, Daniel got promoted, and he was the head guy over all of the, over the province of Babylon, and over all the wise men. That's what it was. He was the ruler over all the wise men of Babylon. And that means he just got to sit back, and you wonder how wise some of those wise men were. You know, some of them might have been pretty smart, but some of them may not have been that smart. So I thought that was pretty good, but he was elevated to the top. And we'll see in other verses in the same book where Daniel had an excellent spirit, and the excellent spirit that was found within him is what endeared him to those people that he served. So, and even though his friends were put over the affairs of the provinces of Babylon, Daniel got to sit in the gate. That means he's inside the kingdom. He's in the palace, which is kind of where he grew up. You know? So, I hope you learned something. And we'll continue learning more about Daniel. He's a very, very interesting character. One thing that separates Daniel from every other person that I've ever read about in the Bible, he is the only one next to Jesus that there's never said that he ever did anything wrong. Ever. Now, he may have, but it's not recorded. Daniel never did anything wrong. He never, first of all, he never gave God any lip, like some of these other prophets did. And it's never recorded that he ever did anything inappropriate, improper, wrong, or anything worthy that God needed to put. Now, I don't think he was perfect. I think he was, a human being, Did he go take over garbage cans when he was 14 years old? Probably. That's a guy thing. That's what we all like to do. We go to garbage cans. So,